Nevertheless, everyone in this country who files a tax return is going to see a much lower tax bill, tax liability this next year as a result of what we did. So that's a lot right there, Mr. President, in and of itself. But the one big beautiful bill didn't end with the working families tax cuts. We also invested in a more secure border and safer streets. We made a historic investment in our national security, and we repealed the Democrats' natural gas tax and took steps to unleash American energy production to ensure that Americans have stable, plentiful, and affordable supply of energy. We took measures to modernize the farm safety net, something very important in my state of South Dakota, to address housing costs, to repair and upgrade our air traffic control system. Now, Mr. President, I could keep going. The working families tax cuts and the rest of the one big beautiful bill accomplished a lot for hardworking.
Listen to this auditory assault on the soul of democracy, this brazen display of oligarchic triumph dressed in the language of populism, because what you just witnessed is nothing less than the architectural blueprint of American plutocracy being celebrated as a gift to working families. And I need you to understand the sheer magnitude of what Senate Majority Leader John Thune just revealed in that clip, the way he stands there without shame or hesitation, bragging about locking in one of the most catastrophic wealth transfers in modern American history, while wrapping it in the gauzy rhetoric of tax relief and family values, as though the permanent enshrinement of regressive fiscal policy represents anything other than the wholesale looting of the public treasury on behalf of the already obscenely wealthy. This is Thune declaring after the vote that they're fulfilling the mandate entrusted to them. Would decrease federal tax revenue by $4.5 trillion from 2025 through 2034, would add $2.4 trillion to primary deficits over the coming decade, adding $3 trillion to the debt including interest, and if its temporary provisions are extended without offsets, it would add $5 trillion to the debt. Yet here we have Republican leadership presenting this fiscal devastation as prudent governance, while millions of Americans struggle with housing costs, medical debt, and the everyday violence of economic precarity. But let us examine the specific claims Thune makes, because this is where the rhetorical sleight of hand becomes truly obscene. The way he announces that everyone in this country who files a tax return is going to see a much lower tax bill, when the empirical reality reveals something altogether different and far more sinister in its implications for American society. Under the enacted law, the average family earning less than $50,000 will get about $250 in tax cuts in 2027, less than $1 a day, while the average tax filer earning $1 million or more a year will receive over $100,000 in tax breaks, which means that when Thune says everyone benefits, he's technically correct in the most meaningless way possible, the way you might say everyone at a feast gets food, while one person receives crumbs and another receives a 7-course meal prepared by Michelin-starred chefs, and this is before we account for the reality that the combined impact of the megabill and the Trump administration's sweeping and regressive tariffs will leave households with incomes in the bottom 70% worse off, meaning that for the vast majority of Americans, the supposed tax cut will be more than offset by increased costs for consumer goods, creating a net loss for working families, while the wealthy laugh all the way to their offshore accounts. The cognitive dissonance required to celebrate this outcome as a victory for hardworking Americans represents either stunning economic illiteracy or deliberate deception, and given Thune's position, I'm inclined toward the latter interpretation, because nobody ascends to Senate leadership without understanding exactly whose interests they serve. Now Thune pivots to borders and what he calls investing in a more secure border and safer streets, alongside a historic investment in our national security, as though these priorities emerged organically from the needs of the American people rather than from the fever dreams of white nationalists. Ideology wrapped in national security language, and what he's actually describing is spending trillions to extend the 2017 tax cuts while steering more money to the military and immigration enforcement, which tells you everything about Republican priorities, because they can always find money for walls and weapons and deportation forces. But universal health care remains a bridge too far, affordable housing an impossible dream, student debt relief a moral hazard, as though the genuine moral hazard isn't allowing billionaires to accumulate wealth beyond the capacity of human comprehension, while children go hungry in the richest nation in human history. This is the architecture of authoritarian capitalism, where borders become militarized zones of exclusion, while the mechanisms of social solidarity are systematically dismantled, where investment in human welfare is derided as socialism, while investment in the carceral state and military apparatus is celebrated as patriotism, and Thune's casual linkage of these priorities reveals the ideological through line connecting xenophobic border theater with the upward redistribution of wealth, because both serve to concentrate power and resources while fostering divisions among those who might otherwise unite against their exploitation. But wait, there's more, because Thune then brags about repealing the Democrats' natural gas tax, which requires translation from Republican doublespeak into actual reality, and what he's referring to is the Waste Emissions Charge (WAC) passed through the IRA in 2022, requiring oil and gas operators to pay a penalty fee if they exceed a certain level of methane pollution, along with the Biden-led EPA rule implementing it, which the Republican-controlled Congress voted to eliminate, meaning they've repealed a modest fee on one of the most potent greenhouse gases contributing to climate catastrophe so that fossil fuel companies can continue poisoning the atmosphere without financial consequence. The bill eliminates a program administered by the Environmental Protection Agency that provides support for reducing methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, and repeals a charge on methane emissions from facilities that contain petroleum and natural gas systems, which in any rational policy framework would be understood as subsidizing environmental destruction, as transferring the costs of corporate pollution onto the public, who must then bear the consequences of accelerating climate breakdown. But in Thune's telling, this becomes unleashing American energy production to ensure affordable energy, as though there's something affordable about the fires and floods and heat waves that are already displacing millions, and will displace hundreds of millions more, as the planet becomes increasingly uninhabitable for human civilization. This framing of climate policy repeal as economic liberation reveals the depths of Republican commitment to fossil fuel interests over human survival, because the law will rapidly phase out the credits and crush the booming manufacturing and clean energy industries in communities across the United States, and repealing the clean energy tax credits would worsen the affordability crisis, raise energy bills, harm grid reliability, kill jobs, and inflame the climate crisis. Yet Thune presents this civilizational suicide pact as responsible governance because the Republican Party has become so thoroughly captured by extractive industries that they literally cannot conceive of energy policy that doesn't center fossil fuel profits, regardless of the existential consequences. The bill targets clean energy credits passed as part of the IRA, including rolling back credits for wind and solar. The federal EV tax credit for new, used, and commercial clean vehicles ended, and the law is expected to slow the momentum of clean energy adoption and raise the cost barrier for solar and EV upgrades, meaning Republicans are actively working to ensure Americans remain dependent on fossil fuels, even as the renewable energy revolution accelerates globally, condemning us to economic backwardness and environmental catastrophe simultaneously, because that's what happens when oligarchs purchase political power and use it to protect their investments at the expense of everyone and everything else. And here's where we need to talk about what this bill actually does to the social safety net, because Thune mentions agriculture and housing and air traffic control as though these technical provisions constitute the substance of the legislation, but what he very carefully doesn't mention is that the bill is offsetting some costs with cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, along with major changes to Medicaid, the joint federal and state program that provides health care for roughly 70 million low-income, elderly, and disabled Americans. An early estimate suggests around 11 million people could lose coverage under the GOP bill. Let me repeat that because it deserves to penetrate. 11 million people losing healthcare coverage, so that millionaires can receive an average tax cut exceeding $100,000, which represents a moral calculus so depraved that it beggars belief, except that we've now normalized such cruelty as the price of doing business in contemporary America. Medicaid and SNAP funding take significant hits, resulting in reduced eligibility or enrollment, increased work requirements, and lower funding levels, and some expect millions to lose healthcare coverage or food assistance because of those program cuts, which in practical terms means families will have to choose between medications and rent, between food and utilities, between survival and dignity, while Thune stands in the Senate chamber congratulating himself on tax relief for hard-working Americans, as though the Americans losing healthcare and food assistance don't work hard, or perhaps don't count as real Americans in the Republican moral universe. The bill establishes work requirements for able-bodied adults who are choosing not to work and do not have young dependent children or elderly parents in their care, requiring able-bodied adults without dependents to work, participate in a work training program, enroll in school, or volunteer for 20 hours per week in order to receive taxpayer-subsidized Medicaid coverage, which encodes the Republican assumption that poverty results from moral failing rather than structural inequality, that people need the threat of destitution to motivate work rather than living wages and dignified employment conditions. And the language itself reveals the ideological project, because who determines what constitutes being able-bodied, what counts as choosing not to work in an economy that systematically underemploys millions while concentrating wealth among those who inherited their fortunes or extracted them through financial manipulation rather than labor. This is poverty governance through punishment and surveillance, the Victorian workhouse reimagined for the 21st century, and it will kill people through denied healthcare and inadequate nutrition, while Republicans congratulate themselves on promoting personal responsibility and fiscal discipline. Now I want you to consider the breathtaking hypocrisy at the heart of Republican fiscal policy, because these are the same people who lectured Democrats about deficits for decades, who claimed the national debt represented an existential threat requiring austerity and spending cuts, who said we couldn't afford universal health care or free college or infrastructure investment because the deficit, always the deficit, except that concern for fiscal responsibility mysteriously evaporates when the question becomes whether to extend tax cuts for the wealthy, as Republicans made temporary provisions in the 2017 law so that the official cost over a decade would appear far smaller, limiting the projected cost to $1.5 trillion, but now they want to make these provisions permanent, and the Joint Committee on Taxation projects that extending them would cost more than $4.6 trillion over the next decade, not including interest on the resulting debt. This is the tell, the moment that reveals everything, because deficits only matter when they might benefit ordinary people, but become irrelevant abstractions when the question is enriching those who already possess obscene wealth, and the fact that nonpartisan analysts say the measure, if enacted, would add about $5.7 trillion to the federal government's debt over the next decade, while Senate Republicans contend the cost is $1.5 trillion, saying that the effects of extending existing tax policy that was scheduled to expire should not be counted in the measure's cost, reveals the accounting gimmickry that allows Republicans to pretend fiscal responsibility while engaging in the largest upward wealth transfer in modern history. Republican leaders want to simply say publicly that extending Trump's tax cuts have no cost, and they want Americans to believe that, which might even sound reasonable to someone not following the ins and outs of Congress, because the taxes people pay in 2026 would not change from what they pay in 2025 if these provisions are extended. But this represents the most cynical form of political manipulation, because it treats the expiration date built into the original legislation as the natural baseline rather than the deliberate sunset provision included specifically to hide the true cost, and now Republicans are using that sunset to claim that making permanent tax cuts that were designed to be temporary represents cost-free policy, when in fact it represents a massive multi-trillion-dollar commitment that will constrain public investment for generations while enriching those who need it least. This is how plutocracy operates in the 21st century, not through naked force but through rhetorical manipulation and budgetary sleight of hand, through claims about working families that obscure the reality of wealth concentration, through the language of populism deployed in service of oligarchic ends. And we must reckon with the climate provisions, because this might be the most consequential element of Republican governance, even as it receives insufficient attention in mainstream political discourse, because the law will generate more climate disasters and harm to frontline communities by lowering fees required to lease land for oil and natural gas drilling and establishing a minimum number of required onshore and offshore oil and gas sales annually, meaning Republicans have literally mandated ongoing fossil fuel extraction regardless of market conditions or climate consequences, have enshrined in law the requirement that we continue poisoning the atmosphere and accelerating civilizational collapse, and this represents such a profound betrayal of future generations that I struggle to find language adequate to its moral enormity. The bill eliminates hundreds of billions of dollars of Biden's unnecessary Green New Deal subsidies, such as ending the commercial EV tax credit, which Republicans frame as ending wasteful spending, when in fact these credits were driving the industrial transformation necessary to prevent catastrophic climate breakdown, were creating millions of jobs in renewable energy and advanced manufacturing, were positioning America to lead the global clean energy economy that will define the 21st century whether we participate or cede that leadership to China and Europe. The GOP's repeal of the clean energy tax credits would raise American household energy bills and could increase annual energy bills up to $122 per household across the country in 2040, and over $500 per year in some states, meaning that even by the narrow metric of consumer costs that Republicans claim to prioritize, this policy represents a net loss for American families. But of course consumer costs were never the actual consideration, because the real constituency is the fossil fuel industry that has spent decades funding climate denial and purchasing political influence to protect their business model, regardless of its incompatibility with human survival on a habitable planet. The fact that businesses are pulling back after the House pulled the rug out from all those businesses who had been already investing and planning based on these tax credits, and the biggest states for clean energy projects are red states, reveals that even from a narrow economic development perspective, this represents catastrophically bad policy, but Republicans would rather sacrifice jobs and investment in their own states than allow the energy transition to proceed because fossil fuel money talks and planetary survival walks. When Thune mentions that they took measures to modernize the farm safety net and address housing costs, he's engaging in the kind of cursory hand-waving that characterizes Republican approaches to genuine social problems, because these provisions represent tiny fractions of a massive bill whose primary purpose is enriching the already wealthy, and the fact that he can't spend more than a sentence on them reveals their peripheral status in the Republican imagination, because how much can you care about housing costs when you've just passed a bill that takes away health coverage under Medicaid and food assistance under SNAP, in an effort to partially offset the tax cuts cost, meaning families who rely on Medicaid to see a doctor and on SNAP to buy groceries will lose more to cuts and tariffs than they gain from the tax cuts. The cognitive dissonance is staggering unless you understand that for Republicans, the working families they claim to champion are purely rhetorical constructs, useful for campaign messaging but irrelevant to actual governance, which exists to serve capital and maintain the hierarchies that concentrate wealth and power among those who already possess both in abundance. And we need to talk about who John Thune actually is, and what his elevation to Senate Majority Leader represents for the trajectory of American conservatism, because this is a man who drew the wrath of Donald Trump for pushing back on the former president's false claims about winning the 2020 election, directly denounced Trump for attempting to overturn the results and his role in the January 6 riot at the Capitol, calling his involvement and that of the rioters inexcusable, and yet now stands as Trump's loyal lieutenant shepherding the MAGA agenda through the Senate with ruthless efficiency, which tells you everything about how power operates in the contemporary Republican Party. Trump and Thune have found a path to a productive working relationship, and Trump applauded his work, writing that he thanks Majority Leader John Thune and the Republican Senate for working so hard on funding the Trump border agenda, revealing that whatever principles Thune might have possessed regarding democratic norms and constitutional governance evaporated the moment it became clear that his political survival and advancement required capitulation to Trumpism, because that's how authoritarianism consolidates itself, not primarily through true believers, but through careerists and opportunists, who calculate that collaboration serves their interests better than resistance. Thune stressed that understanding the unique aspects of how the Senate operates is something he'd have to share with the president, and with a Republican trifecta in Washington, GOP leaders have touted a mandate to deliver for the American people on Trump's agenda, which frames Thune's role as translator between Trump's ide-driven impulses and Senate parliamentary procedure, as though the problem with Trumpism is insufficient attention to legislative process, rather than its fundamentally anti-democratic character and its subordination of governance to personal loyalty and oligarchic interests. Thune represents the institutionalist wing of the Republican Party, trying to maintain some procedural propriety while implementing substantive policies that dismantle the social contract and concentrate wealth upward, which makes him in some ways more dangerous than the MAGA true believers, because he provides a veneer of respectability and competence to an agenda whose consequences will be devastating for millions of Americans, and whose long-term trajectory points toward the kind of oligarchic authoritarianism we've seen emerge in places like Hungary and Russia. What we're witnessing is the consolidation of minoritarian rule through institutions designed to frustrate democratic accountability, because remember that the Senate passed its version of what President Donald Trump dubbed his one big beautiful bill on a mostly party-line vote of 51-50, meaning a bare majority representing far less than a majority of the American population is imposing transformational changes that, according to multiple polls, a majority of Americans oppose, and this is only possible because of the Senate's grotesque malapportionment that grants Wyoming and California equal representation despite California having nearly 70 times Wyoming's population, because of the filibuster that Republicans temporarily suspended through reconciliation to pass tax cuts they'd never suspend to pass healthcare expansion or climate action, because of a Supreme Court stacked with partisan hacks who rubber-stamp Republican power grabs while striking down Democratic initiatives, because American democracy has become a procedural shell increasingly emptied of substantive meaning as economic oligarchy captures political institutions and wields them in service of continued wealth extraction. And the language Thune uses deserves close analysis, because this is how power conceals itself in contemporary America, through rhetoric about working families and mandates and tax relief that inverts the reality of who benefits and who suffers, through the claim to represent ordinary Americans while implementing policies that immiserate them, through the performance of populism while serving plutocracy. When he says they made a historic investment in our national security, he means they're funneling more billions into a military-industrial complex already bloated beyond reason, while millions lack healthcare and housing, because national security in Republican discourse never means security from poverty or illness or climate catastrophe, but always means more weapons, more surveillance, more resources directed toward maintaining American imperial dominance and domestic control. When he talks about unleashing American energy production, he means unleashing fossil fuel extraction regardless of climate consequences, because freedom in Republican discourse means freedom for capital to exploit and extract without regulation or accountability, never freedom from precarity or pollution, or the violence of market-imposed deprivation. The tax provisions of the Republican megabill double down on the failures of the 2017 tax law, which was skewed in favor of the richest people in the country, was expensive and eroded the nation's revenue base, and didn't produce the promised economic gains for working people, and instead of changing course and prioritizing people with low and moderate incomes as Republicans' campaign rhetoric about supporting hard-pressed working families suggested, the new law again gives enormous permanent tax cuts to wealthy households, while failing to deliver for individuals and families with low and middle incomes, many of whom will be hurt by the law's cuts to healthcare and food assistance. Yet here we are watching Thune celebrate this outcome as though it represents anything other than the naked exercise of class power, the use of governmental authority to transfer resources from those who need them to those who hoard them, the subordination of democratic institutions to oligarchic imperatives. This is the reality beneath the rhetoric, the truth that must be excavated from beneath the layers of obfuscation and misdirection, and the fact that they can pass this legislation while claiming to serve working families reveals the utter contempt Republicans hold for public intelligence and democratic accountability. The historical parallel that keeps emerging is the Gilded Age, that period of robber baron capitalism and political corruption that eventually provoked the progressive era reforms that established the regulatory state and social safety net. Republicans are now systematically dismantling, except that we lack the labor movement and reform coalitions that forced those changes, because decades of neoliberal policy and anti-union warfare have gutted the organizational capacity that might resist this onslaught, leaving us with a politics of spectacle and performance where outrage circulates on social media but rarely translates into sustained collective action capable of challenging entrenched power. And perhaps that's the most depressing dimension of this moment. The way we can see clearly what's happening, can document the wealth transfer and policy failures, can produce endless studies demonstrating the regressive distributional impact of Republican tax policy. Yet none of it seems to matter, because the institutions that might translate popular opposition into political change have been captured or neutralized, or never possessed the power we imagined they did, leaving us trapped in a procedural labyrinth where Republicans win elections through voter suppression and gerrymandering and the structural advantages of American federalism, then claim mandates to implement unpopular policies that further entrench their power by flooding politics with dark money and starving public investment that might enable economic mobility and civic participation. What Thune is describing is the logic of managed decline, the conscious choice to prioritize wealth extraction over social investment, to dismantle the institutions and programs that provide security and opportunity to ordinary Americans while enriching those who already possess more resources than they could spend in 1,000 lifetimes, and this choice will have consequences that compound over time, as crumbling infrastructure and inadequate healthcare and climate catastrophe and educational decay create a society increasingly incapable of providing decent lives for its inhabitants, creating the conditions for either authoritarian
backlash or transformative social movement. And at this moment, the former seems far more likely than the latter, because the Democrats who should be organizing resistance remain trapped in procedural fetishism and means-tested incrementalism that cannot possibly address the scale of the crisis we face. Democrats are poised to contest the Republican talking points about the big beautiful bill at every turn, emphasizing the cuts to Medicaid, as the two parties ready for next year's midterm elections, but this messaging strategy presumes voters will respond to facts and rational argument, when in reality political consciousness is shaped by media ecosystems carefully constructed to insulate conservatives from information that might challenge their worldview, by social identities that trump material interests, by a politics of resentment that Republicans have mastered and Democrats seem constitutionally incapable of countering effectively.
This is what losing looks like when you're invested in democratic norms and procedural legitimacy, and your opponents have abandoned both in pursuit of power, when you bring fact checks to a propaganda war, when you imagine that exposing hypocrisy will shame people who have no shame and seek only to win at any cost. The urgency of this moment cannot be overstated, because what's being locked in through this legislation is a fiscal framework that will constrain progressive possibility for decades, that will be used to justify austerity and cuts to social programs whenever Democrats propose expanding the public sector, that will accelerate inequality and its attendant social pathologies, while Republicans point to the failures their policies created as justification for further privatization and cuts. This is shock doctrine conservatism, the use of crisis and manufactured scarcity to impose an ideological agenda that could never win through transparent democratic contestation, and Thune's triumphant tone reveals that Republicans understand exactly what they've accomplished, even as they dress it in the language of economic populism and fiscal responsibility. So what comes next? What follows from this moment of oligarchic consolidation, dressed as democratic governance? And the answer is that everything depends on whether those of us who see clearly what's happening can build the coalitions and movements capable of challenging entrenched power, whether we can overcome the fragmentation and demoralization that characterizes much of the contemporary left, whether we can articulate a vision of social possibility that speaks to material interests and moral imagination in ways that counter the right's politics of resentment and scapegoating. The task is daunting because it requires not just winning elections but transforming institutions, not just passing better policies but building the organizational capacity to sustain pressure and resist co-optation, not just individual resistance but collective power capable of forcing concessions from capital and its political representatives. What Thune celebrates is the culmination of a decades-long project to undo the New Deal settlement and restore the kind of unaccountable plutocratic rule that characterized the pre-Depression era, and reversing that project will require equivalent ambition and sustained commitment to building democratic power from below, to creating institutions of popular sovereignty that can challenge capital's domination of economic and political life, to imagining futures beyond the barbarism that represents capitalism's contemporary trajectory. The fight continues because it must, because the alternative is accepting a world of intensifying inequality and ecological breakdown and authoritarian brutality, and that's not a world worth inhabiting for those committed to justice and human flourishing. So we organize and we resist, and we build toward a different future, even when the present seems foreclosed, and the enemy triumphant, because history teaches that nothing is permanent, and today's seemingly invincible power structures contain the seeds of their own transformation, if we have the courage and vision to cultivate them.